What's up, Illumineers? Welcome back to another Lorcana video here on Inkspot Games, and today we're going to be talking about another mechanic of this game, another interesting thing you can do, and we're actually going to be talking about a phase before gameplay even starts, and that phase, of course, is called the Mulligan. Now, just a quick recap for those who might not know what the Mulligan is if you're new to the game. Basically, after you draw your first 7 cards, you can pick as many cards as you want from your hand, put them back into the deck, and then draw up to the same amount of cards you got rid of to maybe get a better hand than you had before. But in this video, we're going to talk about the best things to mulligan, the best cards to mulligan, best times to mulligan, when you should mulligan certain cards, and what kind of hands you should be going for in order to have the best game you possibly can. But before we get to that, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy Lorcana content. The channel continues to grow every single day, and it's very, very exciting to see. I want to see that growth continue. So again, if you enjoy this content, like the video, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and thank you so much. So let's get into the video. So what makes Lorcana's mulligan system pretty good is that there's really actually no downside to having a mulligan for your opening hand in this game. I guess technically the only downside you have is that maybe you draw duplicates or your hand just ends up bad anyway, but like in other games you have a smaller hand size if you mulligan, or you have certain disadvantages. Some games that you can't even mulligan at all. So I think that the fact that Lorcana's mulligan system doesn't really have much of a downside, I think promotes really good gameplay, because if both players have playable hands, then the game becomes much more interactive instead of one person just playing and the other person not being able to really do anything. So I think it's a very good mulligan system, and again, there's really no downside to getting new cards into your hand by mulligan and trying to have the best hand you possibly can. Now, there's two sort of different kinds of mulligan, I guess, types you could call them, in terms of how many cards you actually mulligan. This one I call a soft mulligan, which is basically like 3 cards or less. You might have a decent hand already and you just need to get rid of some extra cards. I would say 3 or less is a soft mulligan, or a hard mulligan, which is the majority of your hand, 4 or more, where you're really gunning for something specific, or your hand is just really bad that you need to get rid of as many cards as you possibly can. And in a second, we're going to talk about what kind of card you should mulligan, when you should soft mulligan, when you should hard mulligan, and what kind of things you're looking for in your opening hand, obviously depending on what kind of deck you play. So the first thing we are going to talk about are inkable cards. In this game, you can't play, basically, if you don't have any ink. Last time I checked, as of the recording of this video, there are no zero-cost cards in Lorcana, so you need ink in order to play. You might find yourself with a hand, obviously, again, depending on deck building, when we can talk about deck building and ratios and things like that in a different video, but if you find yourself with an opening hand of a lot of non-inkable cards, you should probably be mulliganing those cards to get inkable cards. Yes, some of those non-inkables are very good, but you can't play them anyway if you don't have ink in your inkwell. The term that's really used for unplayable cards in your hand in basically every card game is called bricks, right? You can't use the card in your hand. The card isn't useful in your hand if you're not playing it, or at the very least you're not inking it. So you need to make sure you have as many inkable cards in your hand as possible. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you have a non-inkable 1-drop like a Lilo or Maleficent, then yeah, that's worth keeping in your hand. Or even like a low cost non-inkable card like a one jump ahead that gets you more ink or something like that, then yeah, maybe that's worth keeping in your hand. But a lot of these non-inkable cards, whether they're songs, characters, actions, whatever, items, should probably be put back in the deck so that you have as much ink as you possibly can. One of the most important parts of this game is maintaining your ink and continuously growing your ink in the early game so that in the end game you have as many options as possible to keep up pace with your opponent. If you're not inking cards early, you're going to have a very, very tough time at the end of the game. And if your hand has too many non-inkables, you're going to run into that problem. Like I said, there are exceptions to this, but a common rule of thumb, no matter how many non-inkables you have in your hand, whether it's a soft mulligan or a hard mulligan, try your best to mulligan to the point where the majority of your cards, if not all of the cards in your hand, are inkable, so that you have a much better time playing through the game and having as many options as possible in the end game. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is what's a mulligan when it comes to card cost, how much ink it costs to play a certain card. Now, don't get me wrong, if the high cost card is inkable, and maybe that's something you drew in your mulligan hand, then that's not the worst thing in the world, because at the very least you're able to ink that card. But one thing to keep in mind here is if it's going to take too long to play a card because it's too high cost and it's just staying in your hand for the majority of the game, then it basically becomes a brick because it's taking the spot of a card you can actually use in the early game. So you want to make sure that you don't have too many high cost cards in your hand. If you are playing this game on the ink curve, like we talked about in a previous video, then you want to try gunning for, hard mulliganing for your 1-drops or your 2-drops, again, so you can kind of build your curve and build your board and ink well as quickly and as early as you possibly can. And you can't do that if your hand has too many high cost cards. Again, if you find yourself with a hand at the mulligan where, oh, I have my 7-drop card, but it's inkable, then yeah, that's not the worst thing in the world because you're at least getting an ink. And again, in a future video, we can talk about what to ink and when to ink things and when not to. But you want to make sure that you are gunning for the low cost cards you need in the early game, which, by the way, doesn't even have to be characters. Even if they're low cost items or actions, you want to try to get those cards so that you are progressing your strategy. If you're not progressing your strategy because you have too many high cost cards in your hand and your opponent is, again, next thing you know, no matter how much ink you have, you find yourself falling behind. And like we just talked about, maintaining ink is important. Another really interesting aspect of this game is card advantage. How many cards you have on your board compared to your opponent, or how many cards you have in your hand compared to your opponent. If you're not playing cards, if you're not progressing your strategy or progressing your game state, then you're going to find that games are going to be a really, really difficult time to get through. So again, be sure to pay attention to how many high cost cards are in your hand and try to get those more immediate playable cards during the mulligan phase. The last thing I want to address when talking about the mulligan is understanding your deck, knowing what is and knowing what isn't in your deck. If you have a very powerful card in your hand and you're like, man, I could really use this at some point in the game, I don't want to get rid of it. Well, if you have 4 copies of that card in the deck, then chances are you are most likely going to see it at some point again, especially if your deck has draw power. Now, obviously there's a chance you don't, but I think it's a risk worth taking if that means getting more playable cards in your hand. Now, the decision becomes difficult if you have a very powerful card in your hand that you can't use immediately, but you only have 1 copy or 2 copies of that card in your deck. Then it becomes a much tougher decision. Obviously, a lot of your really effective cards, you want to have 4 copies, but there are certain like high cost cards or non-inkable cards in certain decks that will run like 1 or 2. And so you need to make that decision of, do I want to risk mulliganing this and not seeing it again? Or do I want to keep this and hold on to it and risk not being really able to progress my strategy because I have a brick in my hand? And again, like I said, a lot of times those are your kind of big like boss high cost characters or board breaking actions. But that's basically up to you, how much you really want that card, and if your strategy can recover or has a chance against your opponent if you don't see that card. That's a much more strategic, more complicated aspect of what to or what not to mulligan. Again, we can talk about deck building in another video, but if you know your deck, if you know how many copies of something you have in your deck, which hopefully you do, that should play a role in what you decide to mulligan and what you decide to keep. So yeah, that was just kind of a quick discussion on the mulligan system in Lorcana. It's very crucial that you know what to and what not to mulligan in this game, because if you're not able to play cards, then you're probably not winning the game, or at the very least, if you're not able to build up your inkwell, then it's going to be very challenging to keep up with your opponent. Again, a lot of this depends on what deck you're playing and what deck building, if you're playing on the ink curve or if you're not. And honestly, sometimes just luck is involved. That's how card games go. It is random. No matter, you could hard mulligan your entire hand, and then the next 7 cards you draw, it might be just as bad. Sometimes that is how it goes, but you need to put yourself in the position to have the best hand possible so that you can win games and establish a board, establish your inkwell, and have plenty of options in the end game so that you can finish your opponent out. So yeah, let me know what your strategy is for the mulligan. Do you follow any of these steps? Was this video helpful for new players? You know, sometimes it can be intimidating when you're seeing your hand and not really knowing what cards to mulligan. Sometimes your hand is just really good and you don't want to mulligan at all. That's also an option that people do. You don't have to mulligan if you feel like your hand is good enough. But yeah, I hope that this video was helpful. And if you enjoyed it, please be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and Illumineers, I'll see you on the next one. Later.